It's 2 o'clock. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome from Glasgow Council from the Voluntary Sector. This is the last in our current series of Our World Reimagined, and looking at the participants, I can see some of our regulars are joining us again. So welcome particularly to those who've been attending regularly throughout the series, but welcome also to those of you who are coming to this for the very first time. We've had a really fascinating series with a variety of different speakers, and we're ending on a big high with a very current topical issue of social care with Neil Crowther. So I'm really looking forward to this afternoon. But my role in chairing this session is done. I'm now going to hand over to Penny Taylor, and she will take us forward and guide us for the rest of this hour. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, my name's Penny Taylor, and it's been my huge privilege to have been asked to sort of facilitate these conversations. This is number 10 in what I have found a really fascinating series, and ideas that I've been listening to and hearing about and sharing with you that I'm seeing now popping up all over the place. So it's wonderful to be sharing in them. Just to remind you that we have a Twitter hashtag OWR Big Ideas. We'll put a note in the chat thing to that lines. It's great to share this thinking, because it's that way I think that it'll gain traction. Just for anybody that isn't au fait with this Zoom thing, if you run your cursor down to the bottom of your screen, you will see various options. One of those is Q&A. If you click on that, it brings up a box that you can move to the side of your screen if you wish, if it's obscuring the screen. That's where you'd put your questions for Neil Crowther, or for anyone else really, but questions for discussion after we've heard Neil speak would be great. If you look at the chat function, it opens up another window where we can share information, exchange comments. And I wonder if I could ask the people that are in attendance already, where are you based? Where are you sitting right now taking part in this conversation from? It would be great to hear that from you. Now it falls to me to introduce our 10th speaker in this fantastic series. And Neil Crowther is co-convener of the Social Care Future, or actually it's Social Care Future, not the Social Care Future, forgive me. Welcome, Neil.
Hi, Penny.
I wonder if, it would be a useful place to start. I know you from Twitter, really. It's really great always, isn't it, when you put a face to someone that you feel like you've made connection with in other forums. I was struck by a tweet you issued this morning that basically, and I paraphrase, said, the fact that we're having to target the largest care homes to be the first for the COVID vaccinations would indicate, perhaps, that that's a problem. So therefore, and while welcoming the vaccination program, we need to be looking at how we deliver care, home care, in the future. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think there's two things. I mean, it's undoubtedly the case that social care has been very much in the news throughout the year, in a way that perhaps in years gone by it hasn't been. But it's been in the news for entirely horrible reasons, frankly. The first part of the pandemic, because of the terrible toll COVID had within care homes in terms of the sheer number of people who have died, which is enormous. But more latterly, the fact that to manage that, relatives have been unable to see one another. Families have been separated by the rules to protect people from the virus within care homes. And, this needn't be an attack on care homes to say that what that reveals is two things. One, clearly care homes place people in a situation of vulnerability, a situation of risk, and that there is evidence to show that the larger the care home, the greater the risk in there. So that's one kind of factor about congregate living from a public health perspective. But I think the other, and what I'm going to talk about today, is that it really puts the accent on what's important to people, which is about having meaning, purpose and connection in their lives. And I think for too long that's been outside of this debate. And I think what the issue of family separation has done is brought that right back into the foreground. And I think those are the things we need to be discussing.
Okay, that sounds really fantastic. And I'm sure that I'm speaking for all. And so far we've got 47 participants, highs from Gower in South Wales right up to Shetland. So really warm welcome, everybody. Neil, I wonder whether I can ask you to give us your presentation.
Sure. So, well, thanks for inviting me to do this. It's a real honour to do it. And it's an honour to do it at this time, because I think the first thing I'd say is just to hope everyone's okay, because this has been an incredibly challenging year, and it continues to be. You know, we've got the potential light at the end of a tunnel of the vaccine, but many of us are facing Christmas without seeing our loved ones. The virus is still out there. I live in London. We're about to go into tier 3. So, you know, we're kind of some way off the end of this, and many other things are going on. So it's hard in this environment to kind of lift our heads up and think about the future, but I think it's really crucial that we do. And so thanks to Glasgow VCS for creating these platforms. I'm going to talk about the future of social care, but I'm going to talk about it from the point of view of how we talk about social care will influence its future. So I'm going to be talking a lot about narrative and language. But I'm going to start with a story of a mini adventure. And this mini adventure involved myself and my dad about 18 months ago. My dad had Alzheimer's. He was diagnosed in 2014. For the first few years, it really didn't have that great an impact on him. But by March of 2019, it had started to affect his ability to do various things. My mum had every year gone up to see my sister, who lives in Edinburgh, for a weekend, and didn't feel she could do it this year without anyone being with my dad. So I said I would go up for the weekend. And we went up there and we did loads of different things together. We went to watch his favourite rugby team. We ate lots of food that my mum would have completely banned him from eating. In fact, we did nothing much else but eating for 24 hours. And then on the Monday afternoon, we were due to I was due to meet my mum with my dad at Wigan train station. She came back from Edinburgh, and then I would get the train back to London. So I said to my dad that morning, what should we do with ourselves? And he said, well, let's go for a drive. And I said, okay, where do you want to go? And he went, there's this place, it's north of Preston. And I said, okay, well, you know, what is it? And he said, well, I can't really remember, but let's just go there. And I said, well, do you know what it's called? No. So anyway, we got in the car and we started driving. And I thought, I've got to have faith that he knows where we're going. And we headed off up the M61 and up the A6. And I said, you any clearer where we're going? He said, no, it's a place that sells things, though. So I said, okay. And then he told me to go left. We ended up in a country lane, slightly lost. So I lost faith at this point and texted my mum and said, have you any idea where we might be going? And I didn't get a reply. So we set back off again. And just as my phone pinged, to my left appeared what must be Europe's largest garden centre, which is odd because my dad has absolutely no interest in gardening whatsoever, but certainly in the northwest of England, garden centres are host to all sorts of culinary delights, and this was clearly what was going on. I'm just going to put my slides on so you can see what this journey had been all about. Just bear with me. So we had been heading north to this custard slice, and my dad had clear intentions and a clear sense of where he wanted to get to. And the minute he polished that off, I said to him, you know, we had about 4 hours to kill, and I just couldn't imagine how we were going to spend 4 hours in a garden centre. And he admitted he had no interest in it. So we went off to Lytham St Anne's and walked on the seafront, and then ate more food, had fish and chips before going to see my mum. And the reason I'm just telling you this story really is just that it kind of encapsulates what I'm going to say later on about adventures, about possibility, about ignoring risk, about not ignoring it, about managing risk, about focusing on what matters to people, even if it's just a custard slice at the end of a rather vague journey, but it really mattered. Not long after this, sadly, my dad had a minor stroke, and I don't think it was that. I think it was experience of being in hospital. He had delirium in hospital. He went to quite a sharp decline after that, and dementia started to take a firmer grip, really, and supporting him became more challenging for my mum, but he was largely contented. I think that was the key thing. It was difficult, but he was happy, really. He still saw his friends and neighbours. He went out and did things like watch rugby league. This was later aided by the facilitation of a community circle. I don't know if you use that phraseology in Scotland. I know GCVS used the connector thing. It's that kind of model that really, really helped. But of course, then lockdown arrived at the beginning of this year. And to a greater or lesser degree, it's deprived all of us of control over our lives, or the ability to be and do the things that matter to us, or be with the people and in the places that confirm who we are and provide us with a sense of belonging. I think that's a common experience to various degrees. And the reality was that my dad's health and well-being deteriorated really rapidly under lockdown, not really because his physiological needs were not being met, they were, but because the rhythm of his life was disrupted, the connections he had were depleted, his scope for autonomy was really seriously diminished. And so it's the failure to achieve what we sometimes class as higher order needs around belonging, around self-esteem, around self-actualization, attacked the foundations of his health and well-being and really created the opportunity for his dementia to really take hold. And I don't think our story is unique if I was to say that it felt as though he just lost the will to live, really. In a matter of weeks, he went from being confused but largely contented to agitated, uncooperative with us or the paid home care workers. He was refusing to take medication or eat or drink. He had to spend a week in hospital, isolated because we couldn't visit him following an emergency admission. And when he came out, he'd lost the ability to walk or talk. And a fortnight later, at the start of September, he sadly died. And the reason I'm telling you this story at this stage is just really to confirm the fact that life and limb personal care, even if it's free, is just never enough. We can be kept alive, but without a life to live, our health and well-being can still go into freefall. And even at the level of that life and limb personal care, as important as it is, what, when, and how we eat, go to bed, get dressed, wash ourselves, are also deeply personal and unique. Who sees us or supports us in these private and intimate moments is a matter that gets to the heart of personal dignity and autonomy. So from my point of view and Social Care Future's point of view, fundamentally great support is about honouring and reaffirming who we are and what matters to us, putting in place the conditions for human flourishing, whatever age or stage we're at in our life. And that means understanding and attending to the things that hold our personhood and identity, our family, our friendships, the place we live in, the things we like to be and do or that we're known for. It means working out what matters to someone and where they want to get to in life, however challenging that might be, and even if it just involves a custard slice. And it means going on adventures, even when the destination is unknown, and focusing on possibilities rather than risks, as I said before. And it's really this analysis that unites those of us that came together to form and grow Social Care Future in 2018. We're about social change. It's a growing, diverse movement unified by a shared vision of a brighter future for and beyond social care, best summarised in the idea that what people seek fundamentally is a life, not a service. It involves people who draw on social care, those who direct or commission it, those who provide it, people who study it, or people who try and affect public policy. We're a very broad-based movement. We've got people who have come to us via the independent living movement because they've been involved in promoting personalised care. Also people increasingly involved in promoting asset-based community development. So it's become quite an umbrella for a range of movements and ideas. And we believe that a functioning approach to social care, or whatever we might call it in future, should help secure and sustain working with people, meaning, purpose, control, and connection in their lives. And we came about really because we felt too much of what we today call social care is either substandard, or it fails to meet people's aspiration for a decent life for themselves or their loved ones. It keeps them alive, but little more. And while great ideas and approach do exist, and we can point to many of them, and these are capable of moving people towards our vision, they're too often at the margins, not at the mainstream of practice, or they sit on a statute book and are not fully implemented, which I think has been your experience of self-directed support in Scotland, for example. Despite major milestones like the Care Act in England or the Self-Directed Support Act in Scotland, reform's often been pointing in the wrong direction and stuck in the doldrums, too often reduced to a question either of finance or systems integration, with social care depicted only as broken and in crisis or as a pressure valve for the NHS. So what we wanted to do was set a new direction and blow winds in the sail of reform. And we wanted to do that through a number of ways. One is to point to what we call glimpses of the future. and build coalitions around them. So these great ideas that we do think can better give people a life, an experience, create connection, give people meaning, purpose, and so on. We wanted to point to those and help grow them and help develop them. So, for example, working with certain councils in England that really want to invest in this and grow these ideas in their areas, or working with sympathetic directors of adult social services or academics or others. So trying to move these ideas forward. We try to challenge things that get in the way, so targeting the obstacles, like time and task commissioning of home care, or overly prescriptive and restrictive monitoring of direct payments. We've been developing, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, a new narrative, and that's what I'm going to focus on. Writing and then sharing a new compelling story of change to win support for the vision and approach that we want. And increasingly now we're thinking about how do we turn all of this into building a movement for lasting change. So we want to become a social movement, and we're working with some people to help us think that through at the moment. So I wanted to talk about narrative. Inspired by other movements, we're drawing upon the discipline of what's called framing. George Lakoff, who's Professor George Lakoff, based in the US, one of the real forward thinkers of this idea, has said that frames are mental structures that shape the way we see the world. In politics, our frames shape our social policies and the institutions we form to carry our policies out. To change our frames is to change all of this. Framing is social change. And just to kind of break that up a little bit, what's really been said is that dominant discourse about a given issue, in our case social care, shared assumptions that exist and patterns of thinking shape the way we think about and feel about ideas. We're not blank slates, but what the Frameworks Institute calls veterans of perception. So if I were to, for example, say the word cafe to you all now, uncontrollably you will have a whole series of words and ideas and associations in your brain, because I've used the word and you've brought all that understanding of a cafe in and filled the gaps. But I could shift that now. If I said hipster coffee shop, all of a sudden you might start thinking about a whole set of other frames and associations. So whenever we use words, whenever you use metaphors or ideas, people have shortcuts in their brain and to their understanding, and they bring that to the understanding of the issue we're talking about. And if we as communicators don't appreciate what those associations or frames are, our messages can fail at best or achieve opposite results at worst, confirming the sort of thinking that gets in our way. So if you want to influence how people think and feel, and hence whether they'll support or do, or what they will support or do, we have to understand what these patterns are now and the opportunities to move people towards the thinking that will cause them to do or to support the things that we want them to. We have to understand both the emotional and rational parts of our brains, appeal to both hearts and minds. So this is about cognitive psychology and the influence of communications over it. It's about how we talk about our issues can motivate people to support us or to change their behaviours. And just to be clear, there's somebody else that's greatly influenced me on this front, a woman called Anna Schenker-Osorio, US-based communications expert. She said, this isn't about saying what's popular. So this isn't just like appealing to what people already think. It's about making popular what needs to be said. Okay, so this isn't just a marketing job. This is about really shifting people in the direction we want them to go in. And a small confession at this stage, I did some work in Scotland several years ago to help write the ambition for the future of social care in Scotland with the Independent Living in Scotland project and various partners. And shortly after that, I went to a seminar that Anna Schenker-Osorio ran, and we all had to bring a piece of literature that we'd written to kind of analyse. And it broke every single rule that I'm about to set out for you. So apologies to my colleagues there, but it's been a good learning point and some of the ideas still stand. But these are just some basic rules that we're following that draw on both good practice articulated by Anna and a range of others. And they're frequently broken in the sort of literature you'll see from NGOs or campaign organisations. The first is to lead with shared values rather than problems. For example, we might say, most of us seek to treat others the way we want to be treated, rather than our treatment of refugees and asylum seekers is horrendous. And we also need to choose values carefully. If we emphasise the wrong values, we can actually cause people to repel from the ideas that we're actually trying to promote. So we need to be choosing the values that seem most likely to move people in the direction we want to move them in. We need to focus on creating something good, not just proposing to make something less bad. So protecting our children's health rather than slowing down climate change, for example. We need to focus on outcomes, not process. As Anna always says, people buy the brownie, not the recipe. But so much of our campaign literature around policy talks about the policy, not the outcomes it's going to bring for people. Related to that, we need to focus on what it is we're seeking, not what we're opposing. We've got to set out the solutions, not just criticise current policy. We need to use explanatory chains and metaphors. Don't just assume people understand how these things fit together. We have to really help them to understand that in the most straightforward way we can. We need to be very clear about the agents of change and what they can and should do, or what they aren't or haven't done. A lot of the time, we just sort of seem to talk about things as though they're just existing in like a free radical in thin air. We don't talk about who's responsible for making the change or why the things have got to the situation they've got to. We've got to be very clear about who's responsible and who does what. We need to target what we sometimes call the persuadable audience and tool up our supporters. Lots of people haven't made up their minds about issues. And this is the audience that we're really focusing on, understanding where they're at and the sort of things that can actually bring them in our direction. But our biggest champions are our chorus line, the people who go out there who want the future that we're articulating. So giving them the means and the tools to take these messages out to audience is key. But messengers also matter. The wrong messengers can kill a message. So it's really crucial to make sure that your spokespeople are the ones that are like to influence people. And then finally, this is a bit of jargon, but this idea that people can be primed and persuaded sounds rather manipulative, but it's important. There's lots of evidence, for example, that if people read about money or see images of money, it primes selfishness. So if we actually want to talk about a future in which people more generously support one another and collectively invest in social care, oddly enough, talking about money as a headline may not be our best way in. We found this, I'll come to it, we found it on a recent audience research. The minute we talked about personal budgets, this debate completely changed from one where people had hitherto been very supportive of choice of control. So money seems to have this effect. And this idea of persuasion is interesting as well. It's really about imagery, context, music. Amnesty International did some really interesting work a few years ago where they were trying to talk and reach new audiences about refugees and asylum seekers. And what they did is run a series of gigs in living rooms. So they invited people to a living room to watch a gig. And that context of the living room completely changed how people felt and what the degree of receptiveness there was to the message. So there's all these kind of factors as well. Okay. So our research is following 4 stages: defining the change that we want to see, what the current landscape looks like, what people's mindsets are like now, and how we might persuade them in future. I've shared the headline vision with you already. It's an articulation of how, and we've also developed more on that to articulate how it might be achieved and who needs to do what. I'll share that with you in a moment. But what we did at the outset of this work was the landscape piece, to try and look at how social care was being talked about now in the print and social media. And Lancaster University have a centre that can do this for us. And they analysed 2.5 million words in the print media. They looked at how social care was discussed on Twitter during the 2019 general election. They analysed political speeches and manifestos. And we also took a look at a sample of campaign literature by NGOs and others. And in addition to that, the Frameworks Institute did a series of on-the-street interviews with members of the public just to find what was coming to mind when they were talking about social care. And this is just a kind of headline summary of what we found from that. And on the left-hand column, you have really our story, the story that we want to tell. And on the right-hand column, where the dominant discourse currently is. So as I said at the outset, our approach is really about people having a life. The current public story is really just about people being kept alive. I think the next one is absolutely crucial. We see social care as a vehicle. It's a means to the end. If you listen to a lot of the discourse, particularly during the last sort of 6 months, social care is talked about as a destination. People in social care, people accessing social care. It's painted as a place rather than something that allows us to have the life that we want to. Our approach is about caring about and supporting each other, the idea of reciprocity, the idea of mutualism. The current public story is very much still about looking after our most vulnerable. And that word vulnerable comes up time and time and time again. And again, it's accelerated really in the last 6 months. We're about nurturing relationships and connections. The public story is very much about a sector or sometimes industry delivering a service. We're about people with gifts and potential and their contribution to their communities. The public story is always about people with needs. We're about growing the value of great care and support. The overwhelming public story is one of the growing cost of life and limb care. Metaphors like a demographic time bomb and silver tsunami dominate a lot of this debate. We're about investment of resources. The current public story is just about spending. And our approach is one where everybody can play a role, this idea of a collaborative society. The public story suggests that only central government can fix this. So that's the framing challenge, if you like. We have to sort of find a way to get from our approach to where people are at or meet them in the middle. So what we've been doing, sorry, let me jump back. We've been carrying out further research, working with an organisation called Equally Ours, and also a public audience research organisation called Survation. And we've been doing qualitative research. So it began with what's called a co-creation forum. That was back in August, where 25 members of the public who were selected for their kind of demographic mix spent about half an hour to an hour every day doing a series of exercises, which were designed to get under the skin of their assumptions, the way they thought, the way they talked about social care. And then towards the end of the week, they were presented with some of our vision and our ideas to ascertain how they responded to it, what they liked and disliked, and what they understood and didn't understand. We took that and refined the message further, developed multiple ways to convey our vision and approach. And then last month, we did 4 focus groups, 2 in what are now called the red wall areas of the north of England, 2 in the south. And these ideas were explored in depth with a facilitator for a few hours. And what we found is that people overwhelmingly supported our vision and the values underpinning it, and some elements of the approach advocated. Some metaphors that we used, which I'm going to explain a bit more about in a second, did aid understanding, such as talking about a web of support, an ecosystem, glue, and these ideas. Of the messages tested, what was interesting, and it comes back to what I said right at the beginning, people were intuitively, I don't know if everyone's heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but people very much saw safety and security as preceding rather than being contingent on all these other things. So, you know, what was most important, that people were washed, fed and dressed. And then you could get onto these other ideas, which presents quite a challenge for us in terms of how we talk about and promote the idea. There were questions of plausibility. People wanted to know how it worked. Could it realistically be achieved and how soon? People are acutely aware, because they've been told for years that social care is a crisis, underfunded, expensive. So they like the idea, but can this be something that we could imagine? And a big issue is trust. People feared that the idea of things that were community-led can mean government disowned. They were still fearful as to whether people could be trusted to take control of their own support. I mentioned the distrust around personal budgets, extensive debates about how you give people money and trust them and monitor them and everything else. So that was quite interesting, if not challenging. So the quantitative research has just gone into the field. We're polling 3,000 members of the public now, breaking down these messages further. They're broken into 4 groups, exploring different versions of the message, which change the metaphors and play around with this idea of who's responsible, as I mentioned earlier. They talk about social care. When social care is good, it's about weaving a web of relationships and support, or nurturing an ecosystem of relationships and support, or gluing together relationships and support. They emphasize social care as a vehicle or social care as a tool to really put forward this means to an end idea. And the agents of change paragraph at the end of the vision, I'll set it out in a second, messes around with different ways to explore the relationship between national government, local councils, and communities, including the voluntary and community sector, just to make sure we get that right. And we're asking people whether we're trying to find out whether it shifts people's understanding, whether it shifts the values they associate with social care, whether they deem it plausible, and if it influences their preparedness to support investment in social care. So that's where we're at. And this is the kind of working vision, which is broken down in the way it's presented to people. But it headlines with the one you've seen, slightly amended. We all want to live in the place we call home, be with the people and things that we love, and do the things that matter to us in communities where we all care about and support each other. If we or those close to us have a health condition or disability during our lives, we might need some extra support to do this. When organised well, this is an important thing in terms of framing. Make sure that people recognise this is a system that has been designed and therefore can be redesigned. There's nothing inevitable about it. Social care helps to weave the web of relationships and support that we all draw upon to lead the lives we want to, with meaning, purpose, and a sense of belonging. In some places it's happening already. Places are thinking differently and imaginatively, connecting people and all of their local resources together to improve everyone's lives. We believe this kind of should be happening everywhere and for everyone, no matter what age or stage we're at in our life. To get there, we need government to start investing and planning long-term in all of our futures, and for more councils to begin working alongside local people and organisations to bring these ideas to life by organising and funding social care differently now. As I said, that's just one version. It could get changed. There's different kind of elements of it, but that's kind of where the research and the framing has led us. But I still think we face one big challenge, and it's a challenge we can't face alone, and I think it's a challenge that the voluntary and community sector and others face as a whole, and it's this: trust. And that's what our message and our ideas have really got to achieve and work on. Thanks. Thanks, Pen.
Thank you so much. That's really superb. Now, if we can lose the slides, we can come back to a different view of the page. Just a reminder to everyone, thank you very much taking part, that we have some fantastic questions coming through on Q&A. So please keep them coming. Let me ask Elke, and forgive me, Elke, if I'm mispronouncing your name, Lefleur. What's the role of digital in your vision, Neil? I mean, I think here in Scotland particularly, if COVID's taught us anything, it's the power of that as a potential connection. And Elke is saying the post-COVID-19 world is likely to be much more digitalised, which will also impact on social care, both with risks and new opportunities. What would be your response to that?
I agree. I think, in fact, with another hat on, because when I'm not doing this, I'm an independent consultant. I've just finished some work at the University of Essex looking at the opportunities and threats to the human rights of older people of digital technologies. So it's been very much on my mind. And in some ways, it's not the technology themselves, it's how they're deployed and how they're used. It's one of our conclusions. I think, again, too often what we see in the field of social care when we talk about digital communication, digital technology, is then presented as opportunities to gain efficiency or to save money, not opportunities to improve well-being or to improve people's lives. Now, of course, there are sweet spots where you can do both of those things, and that's great, if we can use our resources more effectively. But it does link back to the framing question in a way about why would we be using these things. It's clearly kept people together. It can clearly do really powerful things. If people can avoid having to go to the hospital several times a week for an appointment and can actually do telemedicine, that could be really beneficial. At the same time, a point somebody I've worked with who set up Community Links in London, David Robinson, makes, is if you spend any time sitting in a GP surgery waiting room, you'll often see a group of particularly kind of older people come in and maybe talk to the receptionist. And if you listen in, you shouldn't do, but if you listen in, you'll find that many of them aren't coming in for anything to do with their health or well-being, but it's a point of connection. So I think I have a fear about the future just being remote. And I think it has to be about choice again, ultimately.
Thank you very much. Now, just to remind everybody, if you want to ask a question, try and ask it in Q&A if possible. And also, if a question has already been asked that you would ask, give it the thumbs up, click the like symbol, and it will promote it up the list. But here's a question. What you mentioned persuadable audiences. What if the power holder or a major stakeholder, and there's an example given here, a health and social care partnership in Scotland, which again is an integration body, an attempt at bringing those planners together. What if they're not a persuadable audience? What would you do? What would you advise people to do, short of revolution?
Well, it's an interesting one because we've grappled with this, because I think when we began this work, we just hounded everybody who was saying the things that we didn't like to hear. So, for example, for a long time, the sole message from the NGOs had been, even with hashtags, social care crisis or social care is broken. And the point we were making to them was that even if that's true, repeating it over and over again doesn't necessarily help in actually moving you forward. So, and yet there are still organisations in England that do have a big imprint on the public consciousness around social care that are doing that. So for a while, we kind of, we were haranguing them on Twitter and everywhere else. And then we realized this probably wasn't the most productive way to do it. In fact, we were kind of breaking all our own rules, because more likely than not, we were kind of pushing them further towards that kind of way of thinking. So instead, really, we just tried to kind of, work with the organizations that do want to come on board. And, we found in time that has worked. We've got the local government association down here more or less kind of employs and uses our vision and has given us a bit of money towards the research that I've mentioned. Association of Directors of Adult Social Services, people like the Alzheimer's Society, kind of in between at the minute, but I think are kind of moving towards it. So it's been more about dogged persistence, really. And if there are some that just won't come with you, I think you have to kind of maybe say, well, maybe we're not on quite the same side, and just acknowledge it. There's something I didn't say there, which Annette says, is that if it feels odd in social care, so we can't imagine having enemies per se or opposition. But the reality is we do, because people who don't share this worldview are kind of an obstacle. And so if our message alienates them and upsets them a bit, that might not be the worst thing.
Oh, okay, that's a good challenge. Here's Claire Cairns saying, a big issue in Scotland for the third sector is commissioning and the power imbalance this creates. What recommendations would you have to fund third sector organisations in a more equitable way? And I've written down funding differently query. Yeah, so what could we be doing to make it more equitable?
I mean, there's one school of thought down here is that it's commissioning itself that's the problem. I mean, the guy who was previously in charge of the Care Quality Commission here, David Behan, when he left, said the commissioning experiment has failed in social care. There's kind of various views on how you can move forward. A very kind of radical view is that, everybody should have a budget and be able to kind of buy their own support when they need to. People become commissioners. We've done work, Martin Routledge, who's one of the co-conveners of Social Care Future, has done work with Sky, which is all about asset-based community development, how you commission that within an area. Some interesting work the New Economics Foundation have done, a lovely metaphor in it about councils changing their behaviours so they become like coral reefs around which local agencies can thrive, which is a very different idea from how commissioning works. So, my view really is we need a radical shift there, and it's seems to be one of the hardest things to get at for some reason. It seems sort of really tough to kind of make that move on, but I think it's one of our core goals really to see that change radically. I haven't got a kind of immediate answer. I think it's something we're thinking about.
I mean, it was interesting to hear you talk about, your movement. Because, is it a campaign? Is it a ginger group? What kind of a movement is it? People are wanting, I'm hearing a question here. How does one associate? How can we associate? I assume they mean with your organisation.
Well,
but first off, let's deal with what it is. Ginger group, campaign, political party, what is it?
It's not a political party. As I said at the outset, it's a movement with a shared vision and idea about how the future should be. But I think that the key thing I would say is it's not a campaign in the traditional sense, because it's a doing movement. It contains a lot of people that have some degree of power to change things themselves. And I'll share a blog I wrote the other week, if you like. But we're increasingly of the view that, we could just sit here waiting for the Westminster government to publish a green paper on the future forever, and know that when it comes out, we'll all say it's crap anyway, or we can just get on with developing something ourselves and then flip this and go to government and say, we want you to invest in this. And if that movement's big and broad enough, it includes enough councils, enough organisations, enough NGOs, enough local community groups, disability groups, if we have that plurality, I think it'd be hard to resist. So we're actually at the minute thinking about the idea of articulating effectively a 10-year framework for action in which people kind of commit, almost exist like a covenant, if you like, kind of commitment to one another, and we get behind that. But as I said, we're working with these movement builder experts at the minute to kind of help us think how that would work.
How are you funded, just for my interest and information?
Cap in hand. We are not an organisation. It is largely a voluntary exercise, and any work that we do that is funded is used. So the framing work I've talked about, I think there's about 10 or 12 different organisations have put various amounts of money into a pot to let that happen. without any ties or having to do any reporting back. I hope none of them are watching. So
Thank you. Fiona Purchase has posed a question, or a statement as well. She says, it seems to me if it's easier for everyone to agree, it seems to me as if it's easier for everyone to agree upon the high-level principles and values, but trust and values become fragmented when individuals plan together. How do we achieve partnership in practice so that personal planning isn't undermined by the trust issues and different value bases? That's a huge question. If we crack that, we've probably cracked world democracy. But I think perhaps you've answered that question in terms of, what do you do if people won't play, or is there more you want to say on that, Neil? Yeah, it's basically about individual organisations finding it hard to work together for the same ends, i.e., the user of services.
That's true. I mean, I suppose one question is how far there are people that sort of bring values more into the fore in those discussions. So how far people have actually sat down and discussed what it is they share in common, and then there's always going to be differences of view because the pressures a council's kind of under are going to be quite different to that which a voluntary organisation is under. I mean, this is the key to successful, I don't like the word co-production, but I have to use it. But the key to successful co-production is everybody understanding kind of what the limitations are, what the common goals are. And I think bringing values into that discussion can be really powerful. When we developed our vision the first time around, we did this really interesting exercise where we began just asked everybody in the room to talk to one another about what home meant to them. Yeah. And it stripped a lot away. People were talking about something that was in common rather than in their professional roles and ideas. So I think there are ways in.
And I mean, you mentioned asset-based community development, for instance, which, we have certainly concentrated on in this whole series, yeah. Along with various other principles that underpin what you're doing. Do you think, up until now, perhaps there hasn't been recruitment to values against values high up in, say, commissioning organisations? Do we need to change the way we do that?
It's not an area I profess to be a real expert on, but I know, for example, that I mentioned that my parents had a circle developed for them at the outset. And the woman who did that was a woman called Helen Sanderson, who's been developing this idea of well-being teams. And well-being teams is a completely different way of thinking about kind of domiciliary care, but they recruit on the basis of values rather than skills. So, what's really powerful about that is they'll have somebody who was a hairdresser who has no background experience in social care becomes part of the well-being team because they bring the right values in. In Helen's view, you can train the people to do the work, but the values you can't. So yeah, I think the whole issue of kind of values is really kind of crucial and making sure everyone's on a similar, if not the same page.
Yeah, so there's a big challenge there then in terms of aligning that as far as what people think their priorities are. So that's back to frameworks. Yeah. Let me take another question. We have a social care review taking place in Scotland. It's going to report at breakneck speed by the end of January, I think, is the date. What do you think, all right, if you were in charge of that, what would you be advising that priorities for change should be? And I hear what you're saying, it's underpinned by values, but...
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not. I do spend quite a bit of time in Scotland and have some awareness, but I'm not there, so I don't know. I don't want to.
But in general, if you were to be asked to wave a magic wand around social care anywhere, in the UK, what would you say top priorities?
We've had a similar thing. I mean, it's not got the ambition of the review you've got going in Scotland, but our health and social care committee in the Commons had been doing an inquiry about, it framed it immediately about social care and the NHS, which really annoyed me. But, Anna Severite, who's one of our co-conveners, gave evidence to it. And she just made this very simple point, which is you're all sitting there debating how to fund social care. You've not asked the most important question, which is what is social care for? And how we can conceivably have a serious debate about how we value it, how much we need to invest in it, the role it has in our society, etc., without asking those questions is key. So, as I said, from our point of view, its fundamental role is to support people to achieve a life they have reason to value with meaning, purpose, control, and connection. I think that has to be the starting place. And then to kind of move back from there. I think sadly one of the things that they've got very excited about in Westminster is the free personal care model in Scotland, and I'm a real critic of that, because I don't think it's really where we should be going. I don't think it offers a building block. I don't think it's the sort of support that really does give people what they should expect in 21st century Britain.
Well, that's quite a cliffhanger to stop. I mean, can you sum up what you particularly don't like about free personal care, i.e. the fact it's not really free?
It's not really free, and it's this limited menu of options. And I know full well that in Scotland, just as in England, it ends up being 15-minute care visits for poorly paid and undervalued staff. And there's little else there. And I know that, you know, some benefits in terms of how that maybe can free up family members to provide other forms of support and so on. But I just don't think it's good enough. And my fear is it's talked about as a building block. But the reality is, when you look at the amount of money involved, it won't be a building block, it'll be a full stop, and it'll be deemed that we've sorted out social care, and it'll be so far off the vision that I've set out for you today that I wouldn't support.
Thank you. Well, Fiona Purchase has commented, yeah, free personal care is incompatible with self-directed support and human rights. On that note, let me please welcome, if I may, to give a response from the third sector perspective, Lindsay Mackay. Now, Lindsay's Business Development Manager at Quarriers. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi, Penny. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you, Neil, for that very informative and fascinating presentation. I'm relatively new to the third sector, having only joined Quarriers as an organisation and the third sector as a whole last year. So I've been quite amazed. I've come over from the public sector for a variety of reasons, as many of us do. So I've been quite amazed at the innovation that that I can see in the third sector comparative to the public sector, and what you're talking about, Neil, seems like the sort of a next step in in some of the innovations that we've been taking. I'm terribly sorry. My notes are all over the place because I was I was trying to catch as much as possible in all of these different things, but I wanted to focus particularly on your discussion around language, because I think that's a particularly important point you were making. To have gone to the root of it in the way that you guys have, talking about the sort of the cognitive psychology is very interesting, especially when we look at how media in this country has a tack for demonizing certain aspects of social care, of benefits. And when you mentioned the trust issues about giving people the trust to spend their own money, that instantaneously flashed to how that is being presented for the past couple of decades, whether it's universal benefits up here in Scotland, or whether it's social service benefits, or as you were discussing, SDS. And it's really interesting that you saw such a change so quickly when those conversations started. I think getting to the root of that is going to be something that will probably take some time. But what you guys appear to be doing is something that really, especially here in Scotland, where we have tried really difficult to start moving towards less, I suppose, professional terminology is what you might term it, into more love-based language, essentially, especially with the care review that the children's care review that came out last year, where frameworks and scaffolding and trust and choice and love were all at the center of that. And if we can see the move towards that in our adult services as well, I think the world is our oyster, so to speak. But I'll leave it at that for now.
Join in the conversation. Keep, because that's really fascinating, changing the language. I don't know if you saw, I mean, earlier in this series, we heard Sarah Davidson, who heads up the Carnegie UK Trust in Scotland. The Carnegie has just issued a report about kindness and promoting kindness in healthcare, saying that one of the big lessons out of COVID was that people in clinical teams, in A&Es, on front lines all over Scotland started looking after one another, and they don't want to lose that. Neil, For you, do you think COVID has brought any cause for optimism to the field that you're working in?
It's a difficult question, isn't it? I come back to what I said before, but I think this is yet to be realised yet. I think some in the social care sector, particularly those who might have reason to want to defend large-scale care homes, I think there's been this idea that somehow, because the profile social care has had over the last 6 months, this is going to be beneficial. And I'm just not convinced by that. I think there's a potential it could be beneficial in terms of the important issue of the terms and conditions and the pay of people who work in social care. I think that's absolutely kind of key. But as I said, I think the stories are ones whereby, well, I don't know, I mean, there'll be people watching this or taking part whose families members are in care homes now. There'll be people who are thinking about that in the future. I'm afraid to say, I think for a lot of people, top of mind now, if you think about residential care home, will be, will I ever see my relative again? And that's not a good place for that system to be. And I don't think we should be hammering that message home. That's not my argument. But actually, what I've talked about today is the opposite of that. You know, we also those images of kind of mothers or daughters trying to talk to their relative through a window or something like that. What I'm talking about is the precise opposite of that. Imagine the exact opposite of that image, that togetherness, that love, that connection, that, you know. I think if we can sell that story now, there's an opportunity to build off the back of it, off the back of what's happened. And, you know, we've talked about some of the innovations there around technology. I was astonished at the beginning of this, and Scottish Care, to their credit, did a brilliant job on this, but how few care homes, for example, had even access to an iPad or any Wi-Fi or anything like that. I mean, it was shocking. And maybe it's a generational thing. Maybe the next generation coming through just won't tolerate that. But, you know, come on, wake up, get into the real modern world. That was kind of incredible. So I think there could be some innovations there. But I think the big one for me is, how do we take this negative story, flip it, and talk about something really positive for the future? Because what this has shown us is what we don't want. We have to turn that around and present people with, you know, the brownie, as I said at the beginning, not the recipe.
And Lindsay, from your perspective, you know, picking up those points, what's your response in terms of the full third sector? Do you think that there's more can be done to communicate the positive objectives of the sector as a whole?
I mean, absolutely. I think that, as I said, I'm relatively new to the third sector, and it has been an incredibly eye-opening experience, which shouldn't have been the case coming from the public sector. It should have been that I had already got a lot of this background and a lot of this knowledge working with the work that I did, but we had a silo like most public sector organizations do. So I mean, I've worked throughout COVID, mostly from the comfort of my own home, of course, but I was incredibly impressed with how the third sector came together in ways that we sometimes didn't see local authorities, or weren't able to see them on the front line. And my concern, I suppose, around how we're moving forward is the messages build back better, and absolutely, but you can already see the beginnings of going back to what was before, as opposed to moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's been a theme right across these 10 debates. Neil, from your perspective, what do we need to do as people who buy into this message? What do we need to do to make sure it doesn't slip off a radar and we go back to worse than we were before even?
Well, I wish I had a definite answer for that. I mean, I think, you know, we are flying a plane as we're building it, really. I set out the kind of strategy that we're following and where we want to go next in terms of building a movement. You know, I still think this is one thing I've really noticed in the last year is how dominated the social care debate is by providers of social care. And I don't mean providers are bad people. But it's very strange in any area that the entire debate is dominated by the organisations providing a service and not by the people that are drawing on it. So I think this is key for me about this voice. We've just begun an inquiry led by people who draw on social care. And we're doing that deliberately as a signal about power, that those are the people that have the most experience and should be in the driving seat. Support that, so they draw in people with a range of expertise. So it's not them sat in a room coming up with the answers, it's about them taking the lead. So I think we've got to continue with these signals. I think there is the issue about language and trying to reshape the debate. I think it is really, really crucial. I think even those of us that believe in self-directed support and personalisation can find ourselves slipping into this very paternalistic language to sort of defend a situation, and that reinforces the status quo. I think the other thing, I mentioned this idea, this covenant, this plan that we want to develop and implement, a doing plan rather than an asking plan. I think that's key. But one of the opportunities there is to recognise that actually, in the past we've got upset about postcode lotteries. It's been a big thing for years. It's a postcode lottery. But the reality is that's kind of how the world is to some degree. And if we can gain traction in one area and grow something great, we should just get on with it and do it and then point to it. I think that's the other key. So this isn't about the Scottish government or the Westminster government. It's about kind of everywhere and everything. That would be my other thought.
And giving people illustrations of how it can work. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, in terms of people are asking, in terms of your membership, people are, I'm hearing a call for training, for instance, in some of these skills and this thinking. Is that something that Social Care Future is looking to offer?
Well, it's a debate we're having at the minute. I mean, I should say we are at the minute, and we have been geared towards England, even though we have regular discussions with people in other bits of other parts of the UK or internationally, but we're kind of an England-focused movement. We've got to work out how this research we're doing then gets used. And I think part of that is going to be by working with organisations to think how they apply it to their own comms. I think it will be kind of webinars and training and things like that. But I'm afraid, as with everyone else, there's always the issue of resources. And if we're to do that, how do we make that kind of happen, really? Okay,
well, with 4 minutes to go, we had this discussion last week with Anna Coots, who we were talking about funding models. Would you advocate just spending more to get this sorted out, or do we have to live within existing budgets? There is no magic money tree and all that.
In terms of, we've set this out a bit in this, I'll send, if people are interested, this blog that we wrote. We think there has to be a big injection of cash right now to stabilise this system, or there's going to be no space to build anything new at all, because a lot of it is on its knees, and there's no point in disputing that. However, we don't think it's then about just throwing more money, good money after bad. We think as we go beyond that, we need to be moving towards a very different way of doing things. So it should be about an incremental increase in investment over time. I think we have to think about resources beyond just thinking about cash and money. This is resources in a much more kind of lateral, different way of thinking what you bring to the table. One idea that we'd really like to see is some sort of endowment. There's an organisation here called Power to Change that's trying to develop community businesses, which was a spin-off from the big lottery. There's a £100 million endowment over 10 years. We'd love to sort of see something like that, like a big endowment that really helped sort of stimulate and proliferate these ideas and these investments. And we think that's doable. We don't think that's off the wall as an idea. So yeah, those are a range of things. We need some cash now to make the system work. We need something to stimulate this change and this innovation. And we have to spend more and invest more in social care over the long term.
Oh, thank you so much. It's fantastic to hear you close on exactly that point. I'm afraid we haven't been able to pick up every question that's been asked, but you'll be able to read into those and respond accordingly. Yeah. Lindsay, before we go, in terms of what you've just heard, are you optimistic for change?
I am, yes.
Yeah.
I think that many of the conversations that I've been having around the country have been very reassuring, and to have seen that even your guys' presentations over the past 10 there are big ideas, and seems to be enthusiasm for moving forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. It falls to me now, I've got less than a minute to say thank you so much, not solely to the wonderful people who have presented their big ideas, but to the fab folk who have joined in from basically all over the world as we've gone through this series. That's number 10 finished. That's 2020 nearly out of the way. Here's to 2021, people. Enjoy it and very, very good luck. Personally, I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out the social care review. But regardless of that, I'm sure we can all commit to doing whatever we can to make this really spectacular into the future. Thank you, GCVS.